We're creating an awful lot of global variables here. Each of our functions is a global variable, and it disturbs me. So let's see if we can do better. We could wrap this entire thing in an object and make each of those functions a method on the object. Since we're using ES6, we can go one better and make it a class. Now, I should point out, although JavaScript is an object-oriented programming language, it is not a classical object-oriented programming language. That is to say, it doesn't really use classes. ES6 introduced the class keyword, but it actually uses prototypal inheritance, not class inheritance. Now, in this class, in this course, we're not going to run into any scenarios where that really matters, but you should know it uses prototypal inheritance, not class inheritance like you're used to. We won't get into the differences because it just doesn't matter for anything we're going to be doing. But I want to put that out there since we're going to start using class syntax. So ES6 did introduce a syntax for classes. It's a nice way to organize your code. And we're going to be doing it in React. So it'd be nice if you weren't seeing classes for the first time. So let's wrap this whole thing in a class. How hard can it be? We'll name our class with a capital letter. It is a convention. It's not enforced, but it's conventional. So class app. There we go. We have a class. Cool. Now, what actually happens when the page loads? Most of this is just declaring lots of functions. But what actually executes? What code actually executes here? Do you see anything on here that's actually going to run when the page loads? How about this? It is going to actually grab the form from the page and make a variable out of that, right? Then it's just a bunch of functions. Then, so here's really what happens when the page loads. It starts listening for the event to happen, right? So those two things actually happen when the page loads. So if we were going to put this inside our class, where do you think we would put it? We want it to run first thing. What do you do when you want something to run first thing when you make an object out of a class? You put it in the, say that again? Constructor, indeed. So, this is pretty hard to do in JavaScript. There we go. We just make a method and we name it constructor. So methods in a class, this is the syntax. You don't need the word function. Just put the name of the method, parentheses, curly brace. If you name that method constructor, it's going to be a constructor. So what do we need to do in there? We need to create the form, or grab the form off the page, rather, and start listening for it to be submitted. And that's really the only thing we need to do in the constructor. Now we need to make sure this thing actually gets run, right? So we need to make sure we instantiate this thing at the end. Just like that. Now if this were production ready, I would probably just do that. We're still writing it and we're probably going to have some debugging to do. It might be handy if we saved that instance to a variable called app that we could access in the console. So I'll do that. Const lowercase app equals our new instance of this app class. So then the rest of these functions, they're just going to be methods on this class. So I'll start by just copying and pasting them, or cutting and pasting. Let's do that. Whoops. Yeah. All right, now I'm getting all kinds of syntax errors. That's all right. So we need to make these functions into methods. Yeah. Because before we could just call render item from anywhere, right? But now it's only going to be a method of this class. So I couldn't call render item from the console. If I hadn't saved my instance to app, I couldn't get to it at all. Here I could say app.that, but app is my only global variable. But if I just said new app, the only thing I would have is the class itself. Yep. So then if I imported a library in here that happened to have a function named render item, there'd be no collision. Right? So to turn these from regular old functions into methods, just get rid of const, get rid of equal function. There you go. Now it's a method. Get rid of const, get rid of equal function. Got yourself a method. Get rid of const, get rid of function. You've got yourself a method. Behold, now we have a class. Now it's not going to work just yet, but syntactically we've now made a class. So we'll just deal with our errors as we come to them. So keep this in mind. When you are troubleshooting, and I've been trying to demonstrate this, but I know it sometimes needs to be emphasized. If you're in development on something, keep your developer tools open all the time. If something's not working and you call us over and you don't have your dev tools open, you don't know whether you have an error message, right? You might have an error message. So always keep those dev tools open when you're in development. So let's refresh the page. And rather than just seeing that nothing freaking works, I'm just going to see, oh, hey, I've got an error. Let's work it one error at a time. There you go.
The console there and like the web browser is better at finding errors than it is in our text editor.
Because we haven't configured something that would make it work really well in the text editor, but we will. Yeah, we just haven't done that yet. There are things for the text editor that can find them. Now, runtime errors it's not going to find, and this is a runtime error anyway. So, uncut reference error, handle submit is not defined. At new app, line 4. Line 4, handle submit is not defined. Right, because handle submit is not just a function now, it's actually a method on this object, right? So, can't remember who asked. I think it was you. You were asking about recursion or something, but like, can you access an object from the object? Yeah, you can. And the keyword is, what is it, Kieran? The moment you've been waiting for, this, yes. So I can refer to the current object from inside the object as this. So this.handleSubmit is totally a thing. So this error should go away and we'll get a new error. But that's progress, right? Ooh, no error yet. So there was no problem waiting for the event to happen. We're now waiting, and we're happily doing that. So let's just try to do something here. Captain America Civil War, caca. Which Chris? Evans. Uncut reference error, render item is not defined. That's okay. We're probably just going through and adding this dot in a bunch of places, right? Line 40. Render item is not defined. But this dot render item is totally defined. Refresh the page. Caw! Evans. This dot render item is not a function. That is the same line. We've been betrayed. Let me tell you a little something about this. This will betray you at every turn if you are not clever. But we are going to learn to be clever when we will get the better of this. So this dot render item is not a function on line 40 either. Well, why the heck not? It's right here. Look, app.render item. The heck it ain't a function. It's a function. Look at it. It's right there. So what's going on here? Let's throw debugger inside. Okay, line 40 is inside handle submit, right? Just throw debugger in there. Something like that. I don't know. Something is not something's not happening that we think is happening. So let's try it. Let's just submit anything. Okay, here I am, right inside handle submit, right? So it says this dot render item isn't a function. This dot render item undefined. So what's this? What is this? What do you want this to be? Should be the object, right? It's the form. What? Why? I was just told that inside an object, this will refer to the object. Except when it doesn't. So, as it turns out, this gets bound, as it says. It uses a very fancy word for when the value of this gets set. This gets bound when you call a function. So inside a function, the value of this doesn't depend on where you wrote the function. It depends on how you called the function. It doesn't happen when you write the function. It happens when you invoke or call the function. So if you call a function by saying, say, this dot handle submit, open close parens, we are calling that as a method. And when you call it as a method, this is always going to be bound to whatever was to the left of the dot. You can count on it. But we're not the ones who called handle submit, are we? We didn't put open close parentheses here. We just passed it in as a callback. And JavaScript is the one who actually called the function. And it turns out when a function is invoked as an event handler, this is always bound to the target of the event. Kind of redundant because we can always get to that through ev.target anyway, right? So why bother? Well, I don't know, but that's how it is. So you just have to deal with it. Inside an event handler, this gets bound to the target of the event, even if that event handler was also a method. It's not going to get bound to the object that the method was defined on. It's going to get bound to the target of the event. So how do we overcome this? This is not what we want it to be inside handle submit. So how can we get this to be what we want it to be inside handle submit? There's got to be a way. Let's think about this for a moment. A function that is called as an event handler will always have this bound to the event target. But if we call it as a method, by calling it ourselves with open close parens, it should be bound to the object on which we called it. So how could we fix this? Just think about it for a moment. So inside handle submit, this is not what we want it to be, right? And that's because it's an event handler. It's handling an event. But if it were a method, if we were calling it like a method, it is a method, but if we were calling it that way, then this should be set to what we want it to be. Yeah, Catherine, got an idea? That's not going to help us, unfortunately. We could cheat like that, yes, but I don't want to have to rely on the fact that we named it something. An object should not have to know what it's being named outside of itself. But yeah, that would temporarily fix it. Yeah, Stephanie. This? No, that's a fine suggestion though. Anybody else? I'd like to give you a chance to come up with this one on your own. Dag nabbit, if only handle submit weren't an event handler. Yeah, Mimi? So, okay, say that again.
So you change it so it doesn't declare as consummate, but as its own event?
Well, I heard something in there that was headed in the right direction. What if handle submit weren't the event handler? So what if, like, the event handler were a little anonymous function that we write here that calls handle submit? So now we're calling it, and this will be bound to whatever's to the left of the dot, right? Let's see what happens then. Let's get rid of that debugger. What happened? We didn't prevent default, right? Because now this is the event handler. So it's going to get past the event. So we just pass that event right on into handle submit, which then prevents default, right? Okay. So don't forget, handle submit isn't the event handler anymore, so it didn't have access to the event object. But now it does. So we should be good. Okay, that happened too fast. We got an error, but it was too fast. Let's prevent default out here. Prevent default right here inside this anonymous function. On line 6, this.handleSubmit is not a function. So this is a lovely idea, but now this function is still an event handler, right? So this is already the wrong thing. Gosh, cussing, dang it. I'm telling you, this will betray you at every turn. That, yes. There's that and there's the other. So you can use this, that, and the other. And the other is really your best bet now. Behold the ES6 arrow function. ES6, aka ECMAScript 2015, introduced a new syntax for creating functions, especially anonymous functions, that looks like this. Don't use the keyword function. Instead, use a fancy arrow after your argument list. And that creates a function. So it's kind of a shorter syntax. It comes from Lambda syntax in some other languages. There was also a language called CoffeeScript that compiles into JavaScript that used this syntax for creating functions. So you're still just creating a function. Argument list, fat arrow, equal greater than. Body of the function. The difference between writing it the other way and writing it this way, besides the fact that this is just cooler, arrows are cool, who doesn't love arrows, is that arrow functions bind this the way you want them to. Inside the body of an arrow function, this will be bound to whatever it was on the line where you defined it.
And that's supposed to be a function?
Yeah. So this is basically the same as saying function with that argument, but it's a new syntax for it. Instead of using the keyword function before the argument list, you use an arrow after the argument list.
So what if you want to call it function? How would you? What if you want to call that function?
So right now it's anonymous, right? It's an anonymous function. But if we wanted a named function to be like this, you could still totally do something like this. You can do that. Just put an arrow function on the right side of an equal sign. So this is going to handle that problem with callbacks. So you see arrow functions used as callbacks a lot of times inside the argument list of another function. So let's see if this actually works. Enter flick, Snowpiercer with our main Evans. Okay. Different error. Progress. Render property is not defined on line 27. Line 27. Here we go. Render property. It should be this dot render property, right? Piece of cake. Blah, blah, blah. Cannot read property, render property of undefined on line 27. It says common error, cannot read property such and such of undefined. Don't freak out when you see these. Just break it down. Cannot read property, render property of undefined on line 27. It's trying to access render property of undefined, which means this is undefined. Why is this undefined? What function are we in right now? What function are we in on line 27? Look closer. Right, this function right here, right? Inside render item, this is totally the right thing. Inside this anonymous function here, though, we're not the ones calling it, right? For each is calling it. And for each doesn't bind this to a gosh darn thing. So we could change this to an arrow function. So when you're passing around callbacks, arrow functions are probably going to get you what you want more often than not. So just change that one to an arrow function. Then let's see what happens. What do we got? Gifted with Evans. We're back in business. So we used ES6 classes for the first time. We ran into some stuff with the binding of this. So we used ES6 arrow functions, which are awesome. to overcome that problem. So you asked me a long time ago, Kieran, something about this. Did I answer that question? Okay, cool. Yeah. I don't worry about that. Never stopped me. Okay, just a minute. Let me go ahead and commit this. What did we do here? Use an ES6. Use ES6 class syntax and arrow functions. Part of what it does is prepares for the future. So I would organize my code like this anyway, probably. But we're going to do more to this. And the stuff we're going to do would be a lot more of a pain if we hadn't already done this. So once we get into React, I mean, you're just going to be using arrow functions like it's second nature. But we've already run into some situations where it makes things work that wouldn't. But we're going to add more features to this app where the fact that it's already organized like this is going to make it a lot simpler, believe it or not. Yeah?
When would it not be advantageous to use the arrow function?
If for some reason you had code that depended on the default behavior, if you actually had an event handler that relied on this being bound to the target.
Okay.
So like I write my event handler so that I get it through that event object so that I never rely on the binding of this. But if you had a function that like you weren't in control of, that you knew was going to handle your event, you would make sure that you use the default behavior of event handlers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm kind of confused about this.
Yeah.
Because you're saying that it gets bound to whatever's to the left of it?
To the left of the dot at the time that you call, yeah. At the time that you call the method.
Okay. So like the first instance of this on the screen up there, what is it equal to right now?
So this is inside the constructor, right?
Okay.
So the constructor is essentially being called when we run new app, right? So inside the constructor of a new object, this is going to be set to the object. Because the default behavior is inside a new object. This is bound to the object itself. So this is a function that's being invoked as a constructor. And there's several ways of invoking functions. Just as plain old functions with parentheses and no dots. As methods, which is dot something open close parentheses. As event handlers. And then from the JavaScript internals somehow. Like we don't know for sure how it's calling that for each function, but it's not calling it as a method because for each doesn't know anything about the surrounding object. And as a constructor. So constructors are another way of invoking a method. So we never call like app.constructor, right? But saying new app like this is essentially the same thing as calling app.constructor. So we're invoking the constructor at that time. And that's just one of the rules. When you call a constructor, this is bound to the object. Because you got to have some way to refer to the object itself. Yeah. Yeah.
If you have more than one form, will you have to prevent default twice? Or just that?
So we only added an event listener to one of them, right? So that's the only one that's going to get. This is only going to fire. This is going to fire once for each thing that it's listening for. So if it's getting called twice, then it'll prevent default twice. But if it's not getting triggered by two different events, then no, we don't need to ever call it twice inside the same function. Right? So there's only one particular submit event that it's dealing with at any given time inside that function.
But if you have two submit buttons, you have to repeat that same like 4 lines.
If you have two submit buttons for the same form,
Yeah, two different forms.
two different forms, then you'll have you'll have to add two different event listeners. And if they're each using the same function to handle the event, is that what you're asking? So whichever one gets submitted, that's the one that's going to be inside this event object at that time. So only whichever one submitted is going to be the one whose default is prevented. So the function is going to know which one it was because it's passed through that event object. So it's always going to know which one it was. Yeah.
If you say that this is bound to the object when it's in the constructor, how does it know that it's bound to the object outside of the constructor and the rest of the class? Like when we added this in the other two spots.
So it's going to depend on how those functions get called. So in this case, this.handleSubmit, inside handleSubmit, it's getting called by this.handleSubmit, open close parens, which means handleSubmit is being invoked as a method, which means it's going to be whatever was to the left of this on line 6. Since that's how handleSubmit was called, that's what determines what this is inside handleSubmit. It's not how we wrote handleSubmit, it's how we called handleSubmit. And similarly, the other time was inside renderItem, right? And inside renderItem got called as this.renderItem, open close parens. So again, inside renderItem, this is going to be whatever was to the left of renderItem when we called it. Make sense? So it's certainly a little confusing. We're just going to get in the habit of using arrow functions pretty much so we don't have to worry about it. There will be links in the notes today. If you want to dig into this more and kind of play around, I would encourage you to do that. Write some code, throw in some debuggers, see what this is at different times, and try to get an understanding of it. But we're just going to default to using arrow functions so that we kind of don't have to worry about it anymore. Yep.
When you create the function and you use like the arrow item, and then you want to call that function, are you just using the name that's on the left side of the equal sign, like right next to const?
So the ones we're creating here all happen to be anonymous. So we're not even calling those functions. But if we were, like if we had const say yeah equals whatever, we would just call that by saying say yeah. The fact that it's an arrow function doesn't matter to us by the time we call it.
Okay, and also, I'm still trying to get like into the custom of creating the functions. So when you create them, where you have like const something equals function, because I'm really used to like the way in Java and C++, where you like say like class something and then
Yeah.
function.
Well, now that we're using classes, it's a little more like that, right? We're using actual methods now. And now the functions we're making, unless they're anonymous functions, in which case we use arrow functions,
So
we're back to doing it that way.
and I was gonna say like the traditional way, can you make the arrow functions through the traditional way?
Can we make these methods arrow functions?
Yeah.
We could. We're not going to until next week because we don't have to yet. But yes, you can do that. Cool. Play around with it. Experiment. Try different things. Read some blog posts or whatever that will link you to. Or just accept that arrow functions make your life easier in places where you have anonymous functions. We'll get the hang of it because we'll be doing it a lot.